Hello and welcome to this deep dive.
Hi there.
We're going to be jumping back in time today, way, way back actually, before the big cities and, global networks we see now.
hmm We're looking at that time when most people lived in villages, small towns, life before the major urban boom.
Right. And we're basing this discussion on a really interesting article. It's called Village Networks by Iman M. El Sheikh.
That's the one. And it leans heavily on archaeology, looking at the actual uh, physical remains left behind to piece together what life was like in these early communities. Really fascinating stuff.
So yeah, our goal here is to sort of unpack that source. We want to understand the big changes happening in these villages. They weren't just quiet backwaters.
Definitely not. They were dynamic. And we want to see how they really laid the groundwork for, well, everything that came after, complex societies, basically.
It's easy to forget, but for most of human history, life wasn't lived in giant cities.
Not at all. It was happening in these smaller places, villages, often connected to each other.
Mhm.
But what did that actually look like? What was daily life like then?
Well, the article kicks off by reminding us about one of the absolute biggest shifts ever, farming.
The agricultural revolution. Yeah, it wasn't instant, happened differently everywhere, but moving from just finding food to actively producing it, that changed human life fundamentally.
And the really critical thing farming allowed for was surplus, right? Storing extra food.
Exactly. And that wasn't just about, having a safety net for bad harvests. It meant not everyone had to spend all their time getting food.
So that opens the door for other things.
It creates the potential, yeah. Specialization, people having time for crafts, for organizing, for things beyond just pure subsistence. That's crucial for complexity to develop.
But, and the source makes this clear, it wasn't like farming started, then boom, cities and states everywhere.
No. It was a long process. Took thousands of years. Even after farming became widespread, most people were still living in these smaller farming settlements.
Yeah.
Villages.
Okay. So some of those eventually grew into cities, maybe?
Some did, yes. They were like the seeds. But many others just stayed villages, often linked up with their neighbors. They weren't isolated. They formed these, networks.
And piecing together their stories. Well, written records are super rare for most of these places, right?
Vanishingly rare, or non-existent for the earliest periods. So archaeology becomes absolutely essential. That's what the article stresses.
Makes sense. Things like mud walls, clothes,
Hmm,
they decay.
right. But pottery, stone tools, shell artifacts, foundations of buildings, the durable stuff survives.
So archaeologists are like detectives, basically,
Sure.
looking at these clues.
Pretty much. By excavating carefully, analyzing these objects, the layout of settlements, they can infer a surprising amount about daily life, what people ate, social structures, even trade. They build a narrative from the material culture.
Okay, so let's get into that. What was life like in these early farming villages? Before the big cities, before surplus food totally reshaped things?
Well, the article suggests something interesting. We often think of earlier foraging, hunter-gatherer groups, as being pretty egalitarian, relatively speaking, less fixed social hierarchy.
Okay.
And what's surprising is that this relative equality seems to have stuck around, at least for a while, in the early farming villages too.
Really? Even after settling down and farming?
Initially, yes. The evidence points that way. In these first villages, most people were still heavily involved in producing food planting, harvesting, looking after animals, maybe some hunting on the side.
So everyone's kind of pitching in for the basics.
Largely, yes. Labor was often divided. Maybe along gender lines, the source mentions women potentially focusing more on childcare alongside food production tasks. But crucially, it argues this division didn't automatically mean gender inequality right at the start.
How can archaeologists even tell about inequality? I mean, what are they looking for?
They look at comparisons. Houses, for example, tools, and especially burials.
Burials.
Right. Sites like the Triple E culture in Ukraine, or perhaps the most famous one, Sadalhuk in Turkey. They give us amazing snapshots.
Sadalhuyuk comes up a lot. What did they find there specifically?
Oh, at Sadalhuk, the findings suggest people might have shared tools, even workspaces. The houses are generally quite similar in size.
Okay, similar houses.
Oh,
What about the burials you mentioned?
Yeah, the burials are really telling. Excavations there show that the stuff people were buried with grave goods were of relatively equal value across different individuals. And analyzing the human bones suggests people ate similar diets too. So you put that together, similar houses, similar stuff in graves, similar food. It points towards a more egalitarian structure, at least compared to what came later.
Of course, village life wasn't all smooth sailing, living close together. Diseases spread more easily.
That's the point the source brings up, yeah.
Yeah.
Closer quarters, more potential for epidemics. There's research suggesting maybe increased anxiety about sickness.
And being tied to one place, dependent on crops, you'd worry about the weather constantly.
Hugely. Your livelihood depends on the rain, the sun, the soil. That dependence seems to have shaped spiritual beliefs too. Honoring the land, fertility cycles, often central to early religions.
And those goddess figures found at places like Subtlehug.
Yeah, some interpretations link those to the importance of fertility, childbirth, maybe viewing women as symbols of life and community continuation, given their role. Gender hierarchies tended to get stronger.
Why? What drove that change?
The source links it back partly to that food surplus again. Remember how foragers needed almost everyone working full-time for survival? Farming surpluses eventually allowed women, over time, to have and raise more children. Survival rates likely increased too. The article suggests that for many women, life might have gradually shifted. Less time, perhaps, on the heaviest farm labor alongside men, more focus on raising larger families, managing the household.
Okay, so a shift in roles within the family. And alongside that, the article brings in another huge factor: trade.
Yes, trade. And not just massive, long-distance trade like we think of later with empires.
Yeah.
This is about trade happening between local villages. That was profoundly important, long before the Silk Road kind of thing.
So villages trading with their neighbors? What kind of stuff?
All sorts. When farming villages connected with nearby nomads or pastoralists or even other farmers in different areas, they could get things they didn't have. The classic example the article uses is obsidian.
Ah, the volcanic glass. Super sharp.
Exactly. Incredibly useful for tools. People at Sadaliuk, for instance, were experts at working it. But the obsidian itself didn't come from right there.
So they had to trade for it.
Yes. And the archaeology shows this obsidian wasn't just used locally. It was traded through networks connecting villages across a pretty wide region.
And this wasn't just happening there, right? Other parts of the world too.
Oh yeah. The Lapita culture, spreading across islands in Oceania thousands of years ago, they left behind distinctive pottery, obsidian tools too, marine shells, evidence of exchange between islands, sometimes over surprising distances, even with relatively basic boats.
Wow. And the Americas.
The source mentions Norte Chico in Peru, around the last millennium BCE. Coastal villages had fish and shells. Inland villages grew corn, potatoes, raised llamas. They had a regular exchange going back and forth. Again, not global trade, but significant local networks linking different zones.
Okay, so once you start trading regularly, like the obsidian or fish for corn, it gets more complex than just swapping, right?
Absolutely. Consistent trade needs some infrastructure, maybe paths, ways to carry goods, maybe even ways to produce more than you need yourself specifically for trading.
And that must have really changed the villages themselves.
Huge effect. It boosted food surpluses, for one, but it also really pushed specialization.
How so?
Well, if your village is really good at making pots, and another village needs pots but has great obsidian, you can focus more on pottery. Become more efficient at it because you know you can trade for the obsidian you need.
So you get full-time potters or weavers or tool makers.
Exactly. More people get specialized in crafts instead of everyone needing to farm all day.
But then who manages all this? The trade, the surplus production, maybe building paths or storage?
Now you're getting to it. That coordination, organizing trade, production, infrastructure, it creates a need for administrators,
Right.
organizers, leaders.
Ah, and that's where the social hierarchies really start to bite.
Yes. Concepts like private property, different social classes, maybe even early caste-like systems. They become much more defined, more rigid in these villages that are getting complex through trade and specialization.
And the archaeology shows this change. How?
The burials again. They are perhaps the most dramatic evidence. Remember how the early ones were quite similar?
Yeah, relatively equal grave goods.
Well, over time, that changes. You start finding some graves, even graves of children, packed with valuable items, fancy jewelry, gold, exotic things obtained through trade, while other graves from the same time period have very little.
Children with lots of wealth. They couldn't have earned that themselves.
Precisely. That disparity, especially wealth with young individuals, is strong evidence for inherited status. People weren't just getting wealthy, they were passing that wealth and status down through families. Clear sign of emerging social classes.
And as wealth and status got more locked in, did gender roles change further?
Often, yes. The source suggests male heads of families frequently gain more control over that accumulated wealth and property. Inheritance rules, marriage alliances, they become more strategic, more about maintaining family status and property. Though, it's important to remember there was still a lot of regional variation in exactly how this played out,
So it's like a feedback loop. Trade brings wealth and specialization.
which helps villages grow and get more organized, maybe more powerful.
It allows them to control more trade, leading to more wealth and hierarchy.
Exactly. Especially villages located in strategic spots near trade routes or key resources. They could grow faster, reinforcing those developing hierarchies.
So this whole period, this evolution within the village networks,
Hmm.
it's the crucial step right before the really big cities pop up.
It really is. Many of these complex trade-connected villages either grew into or joined together to become the first large urban centers. It's the crucible where the foundations for city life were forged.
Okay, let's try and summarize this journey a bit. We started way back with those first farming villages. Evidence suggests they were, maybe surprisingly, pretty egalitarian at first, carrying over from foraging times.
Hmm. But then things started to shift. Permanent homes, ideas about ownership, maybe more defined family structures, and critically, local trade networks started developing.
Yeah, that trade seems key. It starts as maybe just getting useful stuff like obsidian or different foods.
But it grows. It needs coordination. It encourages people to specialize in making things. And that leads pretty directly to clearer social divisions, wealth differences, which we can actually see in things like how people were buried centuries later.
Right, very different burials over time.
And the main point, really, is that these village networks, this era before the huge cities, that's where these fundamental changes happen. Moving away from that earlier, relatively flat social structure towards more layered hierarchical systems.
It's like the training ground for complex society.
In a way, yeah, the patterns were being set.
So thinking about this helps you understand the deep, deep roots of things we grapple with today, doesn't it? Property, social status, how trade shapes communities, often unequally.
Absolutely. These aren't new issues. Their origins go way back,
Yeah.
shaped in these small, connected places thousands of years ago. It gives you a different perspective on the foundations of our own complex societies.
Okay, so to wrap up, here's something to think about. So much of our social history, how we structure power and status, wasn't initially forged in giant empires, but right there in these local village networks.
Yeah, the source shows really compellingly how even just local trade started amplifying hierarchies. So the thought to leave you with is, what does that tell us about the forces that shape social structures? Are those same basic dynamics, maybe linked to exchange and resources, still playing out in our incredibly interconnected global world today? Something to ponder.